guys, and welcome back to another video. So today's video is going to be a little bit different from my usual Monday videos, as we are only going to be spending a little bit of time in my sketchbook today. Don't mind the doodles and stuff, or I guess like planning in the background for kind of like the spread. We're going to be mostly doing our little bit of planning onto these little sticky notes. So for a different project, I bought this polymer clay for myself to use to make like little figurines or like anything that I want to make out of like oven baked clay. So I actually started making these little, I think they're called clay hippers. They were like all over my YouTube feed like a few weeks ago, or like maybe a few months ago. So I ended up making little versions of my OCs, but they're so like oddly shaped that I wanted to restart and maybe plan out to make some different ones. So let's go ahead and go to our sticky notes and kind of plan out what we want to do for our hippers. So from my general knowledge, hippers are like little, I guess like figurines might be the best way of saying it, and they kind of like cling on top of your devices. So I've seen people put them on top of their desktops, their phones, their iPads. I think, what else is there? I guess like e-readers and stuff, or anything that has kind of like a flat surface that like a character or like an animal or something can kind of cling on to. So for myself, I do want to make Masaki and Kaisen just because I think it would be kind of cute to have them clinging on the top of one of my desktop screens. So to plan it out, I want to plan out a little bit of the proportions and kind of simplify some of the forms. Now, I'm not going to follow this to a T. It just gives me a little bit of a rough guideline on how their body should be shaped. My biggest problem with my first versions that I ended up squishing down was that the character's head did not really fit on the body in a more natural way if you look at them from the side view. So hopefully me planning it out on the sticky notes will give me a better idea of how to position it so that on the side they don't look too awkward, and then kind of like in the front they can still kind of like lean forward, put their head or like their hands on my flat surface or whatever I want to have them cling onto. So initially when I was planning out these little sketches, I did want to leave a little bit of a gap between the, I guess like where their body would touch the back part of my screen, and I just wanted to add a bit of space to put nano tape, was what I believe people use to adhere these little hippers to their devices and still have them to be tacky and sticky so they adhere to the surface but are able to be still removed afterwards, just in case you want to have like something a little less permanent. Oh, kind of like a little bonus, I do want to add or try to make a little Buddu as well. So we're gonna see if we can do this at the very end, but Buddu is like one of my favorite Pokemon. Just super adorable, super cute, and I feel like it fits both Masaki and Kaisen, so I think it'd be a cute addition. So to kind of start out, I have like an acrylic sheet placed on my desk so that we can work with the clay on top of that surface instead of directly on my white little surface area, I guess. And then I took a piece of kind of like craft tape and put it on one of my watercolor tins. I thought the tin would work kind of like a makeshift version of like a surface that's like both flat at the back and flat on the top, and it was tall enough for me to have the hipper not like touch the surface of my desk, because I do have like a bunch of like little mini boxes and stuff that I could have used, but a lot of them are too short in height, so my hippers would not be able to hang from them to basically be too tall for our surface. So I think my watercolor tin kind of worked as the perfect substitute for the other surfaces that I might want to place my hippers on. From what I've seen from other people who make like these different type of hippers, I've seen some people use like air dry clay, I've seen people use like oven bake or like polymer clay. So for myself, I only have this beige color. I did see that a lot of people have better results when they're able to color their own clay or already have clay that is pre-colored. So either having like a I guess like mixed version of different clay colors, or if you buy like a set or something like that, or if you have like something like air dry clay, you can add like pigments to it and mix your own colors. I don't have like a knack for anything to do with 3D things. I mostly work with 2D illustration, drawing and stuff. Whenever it comes to like sculpture or making anything with 3D, I do get a little bit frustrated and I get a little bit lost when it comes to making sure that things don't look too flat. So while working on these clay pieces, I think for the most part, the body and the head shape and kind of like the majority, like 80% of the chibis were actually looking pretty cute. I think it's once we start getting into the hair that I kind of lose vision about how I should have formed everything. So I did end up buying this clay for a different project, and I do have a video on it. So if you want to see me make a little chibi clay Fremine from Genshin Impact, and I will leave that video in the description. I think that one has a better idea of how I did like the hair and a lot of like the detailings and objects, as well as like, I guess like the painting of the details were a lot neater than what we are going to be doing today. So I do apologize that today's like session is going to be very rough, if anything. So out of the two of my OCs, Masaki was a little bit easy for me to interpret how I would want him to be kind of like as a clay hipper. So Kaisen's clothing, it does kind of throw me for a loop a little bit because he does have like baggier, flowier clothing, which kind of makes it hard for his sleeves to naturally be placed, I guess, on top of like surfaces and stuff, while trying to keep in mind that he's going to be 3D. So for me, I am not going to really pay attention to the inside portion of my characters, or like the underside, if that makes sense. Just the side that makes contact with the device, because I don't want to cause too much bulkiness for any of them. So for Kaisen, if you were to flip him over a little bit later, you'll see that he doesn't really have the bottom portion of his sleeves. Now, I did end up putting Masaki's apron because it was much more flat, and I don't really mind if it's like on his, I guess like his torso area rather than like right under where his head and hands would have been. So yeah, I kind of have Masaki's base already all planned out, and he's just gonna hang out on the side right here while I try to make Kaisen. So for Kaisen's, I did end up having to pull out more clay. So because this clay has been sitting around for quite a while, it didn't exactly like dry out or anything, but you do have to take some time to really knead it so that it's a little bit more pliable. I don't know if you saw like the first few times that I was using this portion of the clay, it would kind of look like it snaps and breaks off, but the more you kind of like knead it and make it a lot softer, it becomes a little bit more like stretchy and smooth. And like if you ever want to like blend the clay in with like another piece, it's easier to do it when it's like super soft rather than having it like super brittle and will break off into really big chunks. I'll also make sure to leave some videos that I've seen in the past from other creators who have made hippers, and like kind of the reason why I even wanted to make them in the first place, because I do like the idea of having like more stuff of my own OCs around like my workspace. And even though I have needle felted, I think Masaki before, I have my two little plushes of Masaki and Kaisen, and then I have a larger one of Masaki as well. But I would like to continue maybe in the future like making just small figurines of my OCs, not exactly like the hippers type. Actually, I've made a clay Masaki before, but I would like to make like maybe smaller ones so that I'm not scared of like knocking them over. I've also think that the one that I did of Masaki is a little bit on the lighter side because he was made with air dried clay and tinfoil rather than just using this kind of polymer clay. But polymer clay does allow me to get a little bit more details here and there. There is like a little bit of a problem that I will run into a little bit later that I thought I was going to remedy by kind of like splitting up the clay portion into two parts. So you might have noticed that once I finished Masaki's kind of like body and I kind of left his head in a bald state before moving on to Kaisen, the reason being is that once I finish both the body portions for Masaki and Kaisen, I am planning on putting them onto little tinfoil stands and then oven baking them for a little while until they're a little bit more firm. And then that way I can kind of do hair on top of like a surface that's a little bit harder, so I don't accidentally like poke and prod into the body by accident, because I do have longer fingernails, as well as like I'm a little bit clumsy when it comes to like 3D or sculpture, so I don't want to accidentally screw anything up at this point. So let's put them onto these little tinfoil stands. I'll throw them in the oven for about, I think it was only half an hour, with I think the temperature was 248 Fahrenheit, or as stated on the box, like the back of this box. So I did not take a photo or really did any footage of me showing the baking process. So I kind of tented them into this little tinfoil cave, I guess, threw them in the oven for half an hour. After that, I let them cool, and here they are. So you can see here, for some reason, Kaisen is not like completely flat. I don't know if it was a mistake when I removed him off of my watercoloring, tin, or if it was when he was hanging on top of the tinfoil that he kind of got a little bit uneven and started to almost like push away from the flat object. So he's kind of more curved than Masaki, who has more of like a right angle when he clings to like the edges. But I think it's okay because the gap can be filled with a little bit of nanotape, and maybe he'll be a little bit sturdier when we put that between the gap of him and the device later on. But because the chibis are a little bit more firmer now, I can kind of put the hair on, and I was hoping that this would allow me to get more detail in the hair so that I would be less afraid. But for some reason, I just had a hard time trying to figure out how I wanted to place the hair in a way that made sense. And the hair portion always trips me up, even when I was working with like, I guess the air dry clay as well as like needle felting, or I think this is mostly those two actually. I tend to make either the hair too flat, and I do kind of like the strands right away. So I have to compensate and really build up the head shape again so that they don't accidentally lose a part of their cranium. But in this case, when I was doing like hair strands, I think I should have just like made a bunch of different little teardrop, like almost like stalactite, stalagmite kind of shapes where they're really pointy and sharp, especially for Masaki, so that I could layer the pieces up and then blend them all together instead of doing it in kind of like this weird way where the hair strands don't really like come to a point per se, like on the top of his head where it should have been where his hair is parted. So I did struggle with it. I ended up like trying to carve in some of the hair, which looks really weird. And then working on Kaisen's, I thought I had an easier time working on his hair a little bit. Maybe at the very end, it just looks a little bit more like his hair strands compared to Masaki's version. And I tried my best to do a little bit of like larger chunks at first and then try to blend in some of the smaller areas afterwards. But this won't be my biggest problem. So I don't know if you guys have used like polymer clay, air dry clay, or like oven baked type of clays before, but air dry clay, because like it just dries over time by having contact with the air, it just gets harder and harder, but it's still very fragile like if you were to drop it. But polymer clay and like these kinds of like oven baked clays are fairly sturdy because they do have like that plastic kind of element to them. So if you bake them correctly, they shouldn't really break in the same way because they should be able to have a little bit of give and bend to them. But if you do not bake them properly and you have like smaller areas, like let's say the tips of the hair and stuff, if you accidentally drop them or you put too much pressure or even like lay them at a weird angle, a lot of those places are going to snap. So luckily I do have like this little, I think it's called Bacon Bond for Sculpey, and I decided to use that for Masaki's ahoge because I was scared it was going to snap off. It's like one of the areas whenever I make a Masaki figurine of any sort that it usually breaks or bends the most. So after that, I put them back into their little tinfoil cave, and I put them in for another half hour, which was kind of a mistake. So I believe the instructions on the back of the box says it's about half an hour for every 6 millimeters. Now, their hair and just like them in general are definitely bigger than 6 millimeters. So luckily, because I ended up baking the body for a total of an hour, it's much more sturdier, but the hair became a little bit more brittle, which kind of sucks. So upon like immediately taking them out of the oven, letting them cool, and then handling them, I snapped off both of the little strands of Masaki's little apron on the backside. So I just took them off. I cut them off after I snapped one of them and then sanded it down a little bit. Now, I don't own any primer, so we are going to take a heck of a lot of time and many layers to cover up the kind of like beige color that we have. So for both the hair and I guess like Kaisen was a little bit easier since he has a lot of black, so the black has very good coverage, but the brown was a little bit watery. I think the skin tone is too, so it took quite a few layers for me to cover up the clay. I think in the past when I made Femine and like some other smaller figurines, I ended up painting the base gray, but that was kind of like a mistake. I was trying to see whether or not my acrylic paints had an easier time adhering to itself instead of adhering just to the clay. It didn't really have that much of a difference, so maybe in the future if I plan to continue to basically paint in the same way, I'll look in to see if there's like a good primer so that I don't have such a hard time painting and getting like a very smooth, even coat of painting. But for the paint, I am using acrylic paint. I believe this one's the Ohuhu brand, and I've had this one for quite a while. And I think from like the previous figures that I've made with clay and stuff, I've always used this paint. So just to be careful when I'm painting, when I'm setting them down on the scrap craft paper, I'm trying my best to paint only like certain sides of the chibis so that when I lay them down, they're not adhering and accidentally ripping and taking up some of the craft paper or completely peeling off of their own paint, and then I have to fill in like little holes. I think also people who can paint like miniatures or like small figurines, I know it's like a hobby for a lot of people. I'm always shocked with the amount of detail and how clean they can work. I don't have the thinness of like brushes. I know there's like ones that are super long and super thin, which you can create some like really nice thin strokes or like small detailing. So I'm always in awe when I see some people paint such small scaled figurines because they're able to put so much detail with such precision. I kind of like paint willy-nilly and then try to clean up the edges with like the other color surrounding it and kind of do a back and forth until the entire thing is kind of filled in properly. I also don't know if there is like a specific type of paint that people use. Sometimes when I'm using like acrylic paint, some of it is a little bit more watery than others, and then some other paints are a little bit more opaque. Like I said, the black one was very opaque. My lighter kind of like burnt sienna brownish color that I was using for the base of Masaki's hair at some point was just very thin, so it took like almost 3 to 4 coats, and then I added a darker brown and then layered up again the same kind of like burnt sienna color on top to just make sure that I cover up any of those like beige gaps that were shown from the clay. But for Kaisen, I think I only did maybe 1 coat, 2 coats at max for I think both his body and his hair for the black color, so his was going a lot smoother than Masaki's. Then it came to painting their eyes, or like their faces in general, I guess. I ended up not giving them mouths. I kind of like the idea of them being a little bit more like doll-like or like a plush, where the mouth isn't really necessary. I just wanted them to have eyes and cheeks so that they can just like rest peacefully on top of my desktop. And I just didn't really trust myself giving them too many details. Initially, when I was doing Masaki's eyes, I used a clay tool, and it has like a little bit of like a ball at the very end of the metal part, and I tried using that to paint in their eyes, but it didn't really work, so I had to go back in and use a paintbrush instead, which kind of worked out a lot better. I was just scared to mess it up at this point. And we're basically at kind of like the last step in this little figurine making of the hippers, which is adding a glaze or like a sealant of some sort. So I'm adding kind of a matte glaze to the inside portion of both Masaki and Kaisen first, so that they can dry on their backs instead of like, like basically glazing the entirety of them and having them be sticky. So while I only painted, or I guess I glazed the underside of both Masaki and Kaisen, I decided to work on the little bud dude that I ended up making. It's very derpy, but it's kind of cute in my opinion. I tried giving him a little mouth, and I'm kind of glad that I ended up not doing that for Masaki and Kaisen because I was not able to get it nice and thin and straight. So yeah, Masaki and Kaisen, they don't have eyebrows, they don't have a mouth. But because I let the inside of the glaze portion of their underside to dry, now I can use that side to allow them to adhere to my watercolor tin once again. I'm using a little bit of like painter's tape to let them adhere to that surface so that they don't slide around. But I can now kind kind of just like glaze over top without having to worry about holding them or missing any spots or leaving fingerprints, I guess, in this case. So I think we're pretty much finished. I'm gonna let them dry, and after that I will give you guys a closer look at both Masaki and Kaisen in their little hipper forms, I guess. Okay, so both Masaki and Kaisen have their glaze already finished. I'm gonna remove the tape just for me to double check. There is a little bit of like pooling. So basically, I think they're pretty much done. So I did use the matte glaze on them. They're still a little bit shiny, but definitely not as shiny as like if you were to use actual like glossy glaze as the finish. But this is kind of what they look like. They look a little silly, and my painting job isn't like too great, but for the most part, I think they can kind of cling to edges. Kaisen, for some reason, I don't know if you can tell, his back is a little bit more like rounded in a sense. So when he clings to like edges, it's either his body's gonna be completely flat and his arms aren't gonna be fully flushed, or his arms will be flushed but his back won't be, or like his clothes. So at least I can put nano tape here. I won't have any nano tape for a little while because I don't have any plans to put them directly on my desktop quite yet, like permanently or like more officially, I guess. I'll show you guys like a quick demonstration at the very end what they're gonna look like. But hopefully you guys enjoyed watching today's video of me making Kaisen and Masaki and a little bit of like a mini Buddu. I don't know if the Buddu is gonna stay on my desktop, but at least these two will eventually in the future when I end up moving office spaces to somewhere a little bit more permanent. But I think, yeah, they turned out a little derpy in a cute way, I think. So yeah, I'll talk to you guys next time in the next video though, and hopefully we'll be back in my sketchbook for next Monday. Bye!